But as we say it, St. Francis de Sales, in France they would say St. Francis de Sales, is a 1902 church. It's unusual in that, believe it or not, we have very, very few classical churches in New York City. In a city with so many churches and so many classical buildings, you would assume that we had a number of classical churches, but we don't. In New York, churches of all Christian denominations are overwhelmingly Gothic, with, a smattering of other styles, among them being classical styles, but then in the end, the total percentage of classical churches among all churches is what? 1 or 2%. That's it. So when you do see one, it bears pointing out. And when you see one that actually is designed with a little verve, a little spirit, maybe not with the budget that the architect would have liked, which would have allowed more lavish ornamentation, say. Think of a great classical church like Saint Jean Baptiste or Saint Ignatius Loyola. Those are rich churches. This one, not as much. But as I say, it's designed with conviction and verve. And I really, really like churches that are designed with conviction and verve. The architect was George H. Streeton. He was a Catholic architect. His other buildings include the St. James Basilican Cathedral in downtown Brooklyn, a church that some of you may know. This church is also notable because this was where one of America's greatest stars was confirmed and served as an altar boy. As a former altar boy myself, this means a great deal to me. And this was James Cagney, who also grew up on 96th Street between 3rd and Lexington. I have never been able to find the exact address. Have you? No. What's that? Oh, okay. Anyway, Cagney, as you know, was of Irish descent, and was raised Catholic, and such were his memories of St. Francis de Sales and his love of it that when he died, his instructions that he had left were that his funeral mass was to be held here, and it was. His pallbearers were one of the most eclectic group of pallbearers ever. Former heavyweight boxing champion Floyd Patterson, Mikhail Baryshnikov, okay, let's see, who else? The Czech film director Milos Forman, and 1986, and Ralph Bellamy. Which I just think that's a perfect touch, Ralph Bellamy. Anyway, and a eulogy from President Reagan was read. Anyway, Cagney grew up in this neighborhood. He was, as a boy, he learned boxing and tap dancing. Again, there he is. There's Floyd Patterson and Mikhail Baryshnikov right there. And he went to Stuyvesant High School. He was really smart. And then to Columbia. But he dropped out of Columbia because his father died in the 1918 flu pandemic. And he had to go to work to support his family. And he did. He worked as a clerk at the New York Public Library. Move in, George. There's plenty of room.
Try not to block other people.
You won't. There's plenty of room. Look at that. Look at that.
Thank you.
Right there. Okay. And he started, he had a desire to learn to be a backstage technician in the theater. And he started to do that at the Lenox Hill Neighborhood House, which was one of the oldest settlement houses in the country. But one night, the director there, Florence James, who went on to become a very well-known theatrical director, put him on stage when somebody was sick and the show had to go on. And the rest is history. But do you know that when he made his first film, he was already 31 years old, which is, much older than we imagine. Groucho Marx was 39. So that's always, those late starts. Some of us appreciate those. Yeah, there's hope. There's still hope.
He was supposed to have studied at the Webster branch of the Public Library in New York.
Yeah.
Can you confirm that?
Probably did. I mean, he was everywhere around the city. He also had an aunt who lived in Midwood, Brooklyn, and he first became interested in movies because she lived across the street from the Vitagraph studios, and he could watch movies being made. Anyway, I mean, it is the perfect New York boyhood. And it was much of it right here in Yorkville. By the way, my favorite Cagney performance of all time is his penultimate film. It was 1, 2, 3. Billy Wilder's 1, 2, 3. One of those films I can just watch over and over and over again. He's so great in it, but he retired right after that film. And he didn't make another film for 20 years when he agreed to appear in Ragtime, which is where he met its director Milos Forman, who would then be one of his pallbearers. Okay, we're going to go down Lexington, so when we go to the corner, take a right. Not all, but much of the west side of Lexington in the low 90s, from about 90th to 95th, is actually in the Carnegie Hill Historic District, including a lot of the very nondescript storefronts. That's something that drives some people, like the Real Estate Board of New York, nuts. That landmark protection is sometimes given for good reasons to very nondescript buildings. But however that may be, just something to keep in mind. None of them is a building to write home about. Not a single. They have plenty of room. I think. Is that famous last words? No, plenty of room. Plenty of room. Yeah. Oh,
It's motorized?
is that a motorized?
Oh, come on.
Okay, so back to the present spot. Talk about nondescript, eh? And I'm not referring to the man who just came out. It's the building, 179 East 93rd. Who knows? Okay, you were about to. Yeah, that's where the Marx Brothers grew up. Everybody, Julius, Leonard, Adolf, or yes, exactly. Got them right. Was those Groucho, Chico, and Harpo, and there were two other brothers, Zeppo and Gummo. And they were all the 5 Marx Brothers at one time, but did you know that they all performed together only one time? That was in Flint, Michigan. And shortly after that, Gummo left. He didn't like the theatrical life. He didn't want it. And so it was down to 4 Marx Brothers. And Zeppo, who, according to their biographers, I'm sorry, I never get to talk about the Marx Brothers, okay? So just indulge me. According to their biographers, you know, in real life, Zeppo was the funniest one. It's true. It's true. And we don't believe it because on film, he's the straight man. And on stage, he was the straight man. Anyway, he left the team after Duck Soup in 1933. And thereafter, it was just the 3, Groucho, Chico, and Harpo. But all 5 grew up here. Now, their parents were immigrants. Simon Marx, who later called himself Samuel Marx, and who was known to everyone as Frenchy, because he was from Alsace, was a tailor. As Groucho says in his one of his autobiographies, he was a very bad tailor. Anyway, he was from Alsace, and he married Minnie Schoenberg, who was from Lower Saxony in Germany. They were Jewish. So they were German Jewish immigrants in Yorkville. And Minnie was herself a musician. She sang and she played the harp, which is where Harpo learned how to play the harp. And just in case you're wondering, Harpo was a superb harpist, and Chico was an outstanding pianist. So their talent was very real. Anyway, it was she, Minnie, the mother, who was the driving force in getting them into show business. Her brother changed his name to Al Sheehan and was a not all, but much of the west side of Lexington in the low 90s. From about 90th to 95th is actually in the Carnegie Hill Historic District, including a lot of the very nondescript storefronts. That's something that drives some people, like the Real Estate Board of New York, nuts. You know, that, you know, landmark protection is sometimes given for good reasons to very nondescript buildings. But however that may be, just something to keep in mind. None of them is a building to write home about. Not a single. They have plenty of room. I think. Is that famous last words? No, plenty of room. Plenty of room. Yeah.
It's motorized?
Is that a motorized?
Oh, come on.
Okay, so back to the present spot. Talk about nondescript, eh? And I'm not referring to the man who just came out. It's the building, 179 East 93rd. Who knows? Okay, you were about to. Yeah, that's where the Marx Brothers grew up. Everybody, Julius, Leonard, Adolf, or yes, exactly. Got them right. Was those Groucho, Chico, and Harpo, and there were 2 other brothers, Zeppo and Gummo. And they were all the 5 Marx Brothers at one time, but did you know that they all performed together only one time? That was in Flint, Michigan. And shortly after that, Gummo Gummo left. He didn't like the theatrical life. He didn't want it. And so it was down to 4 Marx Brothers. And Zeppo, who, according to their biographers, I'm sorry, I never get to talk about the Marx Brothers, okay? So just indulge me. According to their biographers, you know, in real life, Zeppo was the funniest one. It's true. It's true. And we don't believe it because on film, he's the straight man. And on stage, he was the straight man. Anyway, he left the team after Duck Soup in 1933. And thereafter, it was just the 3, Groucho, Chico, and Harpo. But all 5 grew up here. Now, their parents were immigrants. Simon Marx, who later called himself Samuel Marx, and who was known to everyone as Frenchy, because he was from Alsace, was a tailor. As Groucho says in his one of his autobiographies, he was a very bad tailor. Anyway, he was from Alsace, and he married Minnie Schoenberg, who was from Lower Saxony in Germany. They were Jewish. So they were German Jewish immigrants in Yorkville. And Minnie was herself a musician. She sang and she played the harp, which is where Harpo learned how to play the harp. And just in case you're wondering, Harpo was a superb harpist, and Chico was an outstanding pianist. So their talent was very real. Anyway, it was she, Minnie, the mother, who was the driving force in getting them into show business. Her brother changed his name to Al Sheehan, and okay, I guess that's enough showbiz for a while. James Cagney and the Marx Brothers. But you can't really do any better than James Cagney and the Marx Brothers. When you're talking about, you know, immigrants in New York City who sort of really succeeded against tremendous odds. And as I was just saying to Ken, where are you? Right here. We were talking about how great a piano player Chico was. You wonder how. You know, like where did he get it? Because, you know, Chico was not like a dedicated student, okay? He was a juvenile delinquent, and he grew up in a rough neighborhood. And where on earth did James Cagney learn how to tap dance? And what's more, where did he ever decide he wanted to tap dance? You know, these are in a way, these are mysteries. But then, when you sort of begin to peel back the layers, you realize that there was a kind of infrastructure in place in these immigrant neighborhoods, supplied by, in some instances, philanthropy. And that's where an institution like this, right across the street, comes in. This is the 92nd Street Y. And you hear Y, and first thing you think of when you hear Y is probably YMCA, but this is YMHA, originally Young Men's Hebrew Association. In 1945, it became Young Men's and Women's Hebrew Association, both. But again, even so, Y connotes, you know, like old men living in their little bedrooms, and, you know, like maybe a gym, a swimming pool, and whatever. What's that?
Drugs.
What?
Drugs.
Oh, jocks. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I just didn't quite get it. Okay. Yes. Exactly. But here we're talking about something that operated much more like a settlement house. It originated on West 21st Street. I mean, it's really weird that they called it the 92nd Street Y. I'm just kidding. They didn't. It began on West 21st Street, and among the philanthropic members of the established Jewish community who created the Y, we may count Oscar Strauss, who was the brother of Isidore and Nathan Strauss, the owners of Macy's, and Oscar was himself, as President Theodore Roosevelt's Secretary of Commerce and Labor, the first Jewish cabinet member of the United States government. So he was an important early backer of the Y, but the really important backer, the one who, after the Y had moved a couple of times, brought it up here to the corner of Lexington and 92nd, was Jacob Schiff, who was probably the single richest and most powerful member of New York's old established German Jewish community at that time. No, finance. He was pretty much the equal of J.P. Morgan. The Morgan considered him his equal. And anyway, Schiff, it was Dorothy Schiff later, his daughter. Right. But it wasn't this building when they first moved up here. This building came later. And this was the result of the Y's tremendous growth and also its continual sort of redefinition of its mission. Originally, it did have a strongly Jewish focus, and that became very diluted over time. It never went away, but it became diluted, and they became much more inclusive as the years went on, and offered a full program of social services, classes, lectures. If there was a tenement kid who wanted to learn how to tap dance, he or she could go to the 92nd Street Y. And I am sure they had tap dancing classes. I mean, what settlement house worthy of the name didn't have tap dancing classes?
And there are way too many kids today, too many classes, and making too much money.
Yeah, well, anyway, but anyway, over the years, they just kept adding, and they also became a cultural powerhouse. By the 1930s, when this building was built in 1930, Nekarselmer and Leilbach and Garon and Ross were the architects. If anyone is taking notes, and nobody is, this building, by the time this building was built, and the main benefactors of this building were Judge Joseph Proskauer and the Pittsburgh department store tycoon Henry Kaufman. Anyway, hence the Kaufman Auditorium of the 92nd Street Y. They had already, by that time, begun to be this sort of cultural powerhouse with the readings and the lectures and the concerts and all of that we all of us, every one of us here, I am sure, knows and loves the 92nd Street Y for, right? They continued to grow, and in 1968, they built that lovely addition to the south, which was so carefully designed to be in keeping with the original building, really echoing its details and materials and scale and so on. Okay, and now look at it. I mean, this is gigantic. It's a gigantic thing. They have bedrooms, they have the auditorium, they have a swimming pool, they have gymnasiums, they have cafeteria, nursery school, and so on and so forth. And as I say, these settlement houses and like organizations, unbelievably important. when you read the biographies of, say, notable artists and performers, you're just stunned by how often, so-and-so, Louise Nevelson, got her start with an art class at Educational Alliance. And by the way, Educational Alliance, one of the city's most famous settlement houses on East Broadway, was a satellite of 92nd Street Lawn. Yeah. Yes. So, no. We're gonna go. No, we're gonna go this way. Yeah. I don't know what. And say sorry a lot. Very important. The houses were built by William C. Oh, can you get through? Okay. Sorry. By William C. Rhinelander. That's a name you hear a lot up in these parts. Rhinelander. Now, the name sounds German, does it not? And in fact, Rhinelander, right? And they were from the Rhineland-Palatinate originally. But the Rhinelanders actually came to New York, or more specifically, New Rochelle, as Huguenot refugees from France in 1686. And they prospered in shipbuilding, sugar refining, and they amassed considerable land holdings. And by the middle of the 19th century, they were one of the sort of dynastic families of New York City. They particularly owned a lot of property in this part of the city. They had their own summer estate right on the East River at 91st Street. The estates, the summer homes of Gracie, Astor, Rhinelander, Kruger were all on contiguous properties along the East River. The Rhinelanders sort of spread out from that base with land acquisitions throughout the early decades of the 19th century. And the William Rhinelander who built these houses was the brother of Serena and Julia Rhinelander, who built Holy Trinity Church. And they were the first cousins of Lucretia Rhinelander, who was who? Gonna stay till you get it.
Yeah.
Who was Lucretia Rhinelander?
She related to Waldo? That's like
Edith Wharton's mother. Okay. All right. So I just thought everybody wants to know from me, how is this person related to Edith Wharton? So that's how it is. Now, Henry Janeway Hardenberg, the architect of these houses, had already designed some noteworthy row houses on the Upper West Side, where he also designed what? The Dakota. The Dakota was just completed a couple of years before these were begun. Dakota completed 1884, these begun 1886, and you can see, the sort of same picturesque sensibility at work. And much later on, of course, Hardenberg would design the Plaza Hotel and many, many other great buildings. Thus, his name gets into the historic district name, Hardenberg Rhinelander. And of these houses, one of them is particularly notable in the cultural annals of New York City, and that's 1342, second in from the corner, because that was the home for 17 years of Andy Warhol and his mother. And that was during his first great flowering. I mean, the Campbell's Soup paintings, the early films, and so on and so forth. Many of them were actually done in that house where where he maintained a studio. Okay, down one more block. Come with me. Emmanuel Lutheran Church across the street. The congregation originated in 1863, but this church building was built in 1886-88. The architect was Arthur Crooks, who was primarily a church architect. He designed a notable Roman Catholic church, St. Anthony of Padua on Sullivan Street, just before he designed this church for a German Lutheran congregation. Now, when you think Germans, nowadays I think most people probably assume that most of the German immigrants in New York City were Protestants. But it's not the case. About early on, it was about half and half, and then it sort of was a little bit more weighted to the Protestants, among whom members of the Lutheran Church were the most numerous. And when this church was built, this edifice, the bells in the tower, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, were donated by the Empress Augusta of Germany, who was the wife of Kaiser Wilhelm II. And that, I think, is a notable thing. I mean, that sort of recognition of the New York German community, of the size and strength and influence of the New York German community on the part of the most powerful people in Germany. And by the way, by that time, there was a Germany. When German immigration started to New York, there was no German state. That didn't happen until 1871. And but it does mean that by the time this church was built, that was in place. What needs saying that I'm not saying? She's the church's historian.
Yeah, well, the altar was sent over from Germany, and it was all hand carved. You know,
the altar is also from Germany, and it's hand carved. And some of you know how I go on sometimes about German carving, right? You know, carved stonework came to New York with German immigrants. The first great example would be Bethesda Terrace in Central Park, which was carved by hand by German immigrants. Okay, let's go south one block and take a right. I know people who say they prefer these to the Hardenberg Rhinelander houses. About the same vintage, also built by our Mr. Rhinelander, but designed by Hubert and Pearson. Philip Hubert was a French-born architect, and in New York formed a partnership with James Pearson. Their most famous building. I'm sorry. I've got, ever since I started teaching this class every fall to 8th grade girls at Marymount School, I found that it was very effective, making them answer questions all the time, and I got into the habit of addressing the girls that way that I now do that with my tour groups. I never used to do this, but here I am. I was about to say, okay, what's Hubert and Pearson's most famous building? And you hate it when I do this, don't you? You just hate it, and you're thinking, I'm never going on a tour with this guy again. He used to be good, okay. What was their most famous building? All right, I'll tell you. The Chelsea Hotel. Okay, so think Chelsea Hotel, and then look at this, and you sort of, again, it's that whole 1880s wildly picturesque thing. Now, the architectural style that we call Queen Anne, which we in New York so heavily associate with the 1880s, is one of what we would call willful variety, meaning the Victorians, the high Victorians, wanted everything to be as irregular as it could possibly be. This is where all their repressed sexual energies went, was into their architecture. And it was like, the doorways all have to be different. The doorway enframelments are different. The bay windows are different. I mean, one is on the 3rd floor, right? One is on the 2nd floor. Why? Because, one's on the 3rd floor and one's on the 2nd floor. It's different. And the balconies are different. Everything is different. There's nothing standardized across the row. Even the style of the windows, the levels of the windows, it's all different. That's what the 1880s found beautiful. It's what 40 years later people looked back at with horror. It engendered such a backlash, but now it's 2017. We don't have to prefer one thing to another, right? We can like Queen Anne and we can like Beaux-Arts classicism. We don't have to choose. At least I don't have to choose. And I think we like this kind of thing again. Yeah.
How many houses are there here? I can't make it out.
I think there are 4. Well, I think that there are 5. 5 houses. 5 houses. I know, and that's a Queen Anne staple too. You can't figure out how many houses are in the row. You can't tell where one house ends and another house begins. The architect is messing with you in every way that he can. And the Victorians loved it. They just loved it. Yeah, okay. It is. Lots of, asymmetry, studied asymmetry. Okay, let's go. We're going to keep going. By the way, but look how unusual it is. First of all, the ornament. Very unusual on the 2nd floor, kind of Asian seeming. I've looked at it for a long time to see if any of those lines form a swastika, which is, something you find in Asian ornament, but they don't. Nonetheless, it is really unusual. You just don't see ornament like that very often on buildings. And then going up, that central section with that tiled overhanging roof, the way that the fire escapes sort of resolve into a balcony, and look at the doors that open from those apartments onto the balcony. And that's just so unusual. I don't know of another apartment building in the city that looks remotely like this one. And I've really wanted to just sort of study it a little bit more, and I've never had occasion to, but maybe one day. Nor did Christopher ever get to it. So let's turn the corner.
It was just
right
renovated
here.
too. The facade was just renovated.
It's very clean. It's very nice looking right now, and they're probably charging a lot of money. Okay.
Who's the architect?
And just let me say at the outset, wow, this church is just so great. I love this church. And I don't know why it's not much better known. Our Lady of Good Counsel. Truthfully, those of you in this group who, don't live in the neighborhood, did you know this church was here?
No.
And it's just gorgeous. It's also unusual. The guy who designed it, Thomas H. Poole. Now, if I was cruel, I would say, what else did he design? He designed a church that has had some preservation controversy. What is it? St. Paul? Yes, St. Thomas the Apostle on West 118th Street, which is also a fantastic church. I mean, it's almost like an hallucination when you look at St. Thomas the Apostle, because it's just so improbably elaborate. He was an Oxford-educated Englishman, but he was a devout Catholic who wanted to design Catholic churches and felt that he'd stand a better chance in America than in England. So he came to New York, established his practice here, and he did not do cheap churches. Thus, a lot of money was spent on this church. This was 10 years before St. Francis de Sales. Why did Our Lady of Good Counsel have so much money and St. Francis de Sales did not? Who knows? But that's Vermont marble. That's the same marble that's on the outside of the New York Public Library. It's really, really nice stuff. And just the whole scale of the thing, the detailing, the towers, the entryways, and the way that they're set on either side of the central section with that gigantic window is a very unusual sort of composition, very compelling, and really rewards sustained looking. Now, the parishioners were German, and this story sort of all comes together because this church is right across the street from, well, today it's Rupert Towers, 1975, Davis, Brody, and Associates. But what was on the site of Rupert Towers before Rupert Towers? Rupert Brewery. In fact, from 90th to 94th, and from 2nd to 3rd, almost the entirety of that area was taken up by 3 breweries. 2 of them gigantic breweries. Of the gigantic ones, Rupert was 90th to 92nd. That was the brewery. It was founded by Jacob Rupert Sr., whose father, Adolf Rupert, who came from Bavaria. Jacob was actually born in New York, but by my calculations, he was conceived in Bavaria.
He was what?
Conceived.
So he wasn't a true Yankee, huh?
Right. So do we call that an immigrant? I don't know. Anyway, but they were Bavarian background, and Jacob established his brewery here in 1867, and it was in operation until 1965. His son, Colonel Rupert, Jacob Rupert Jr., who also ran the brewery, was the Jacob Rupert who became a U.S. congressman and then bought the New York Yankees. He was the longtime owner of the Yankees. He was the Yankees owner who acquired Babe Ruth, and he's the Yankees owner who built Yankee Stadium in the Bronx. So he was, Jacob Rupert Jr., one of the best known men in New York City. Anyway, the second brewery, which was 92nd to 94th, was bigger than the Rupert Brewery. That was the George Ehret, E-H-R-E-T Brewery. George Ehret was from the Duchy of Baden, in what is today Baden-Württemberg. And so was a New York immigrant named John Jacob Astor. Astor, as you probably know, became New York City's largest landowner. And thereafter, following his death in 1848, the Astor estate was New York City's largest landowner. George Ehret, by the 1870s, was New York City's second largest landowner. So what do you make of the fact that the largest and second largest landowners were both from the Duchy of Baden?
They teach them well in Baden.
All right, what do you make of that? What do you make of that? Huh? Okay. I mean, it's not like they were both just both German. I mean, they were both from the same place. Sounds fishy to me. Okay. Now, so George Ehret and Rupert, were they arch competitors because they were both gigantic breweries? No, they weren't. Actually, you might remember Christopher Gray wrote a column about this once because he was struck by how friendly they seemed. It was almost like if Coke and Pepsi were right next to each other and got along fine. Well, they did. They got along fine because the two families, the Ruperts and the Ehrets, were intermarried.
What else?
And they had all kinds of informal and who knows, maybe even formal agreements in place about, who got what part of the country and this and that. So everything was perfectly amicable. With George Ehret, by the way, he was visiting Germany when World War I broke out. So he was a German visiting Germany. The war broke out. He could not return until 1918. And in the meanwhile, his brewery was seized by the federal government. And he got it back eventually. But it reminds us of just what a horrible time World War I was for German New Yorkers. It was really just awful. Anyway, there was a third brewery, Bert Ringler, but much smaller. So 90th to 94th, 2nd to 3rd, 3 breweries. Who worshipped at Our Lady of Good Counsel? Brewery workers, many of whom were German Catholics. And it's been said, many of the people who worshipped here were also employees of a company called Steinway and Sons, which is in many ways the greatest of all German businesses in New York. Henry Engelhard Steinway from Lower Saxony, just like Minnie Marx, came here, established a piano factory on Varick Street. It grew, was expanded to Astoria by Henry's son, William Steinway, in 1870. And you're thinking, Astoria, Yorkville, the ferry at 92nd Street took people from Yorkville to Astoria from really for almost 100 years.
Until the Triborough Bridge opened.
Yeah, until the Triborough Bridge opened. So in fact, even after Steinway Village was built for Steinway workers, a lot of Steinway workers lived in Yorkville. So they too would probably have been parishioners of Our Lady of Good Counsel and many others besides, including, I'm suspecting, some people with deep pockets. So what happened to the breweries? Ehret went out of business 1935. Just prohibition was kind of rough on those businesses. But Rupert survived and bought Ehret's facilities and stayed afloat till 1965. And then when it closed, there was this large area. I mean, this is an unusually large, area to sort of like fall on the market all at one time. And it became, Rupert Towers, and to the north of them, Yorkville towers designed by Davis Brody. Davis Brody in the 60s and 70s was doing these, this was their thing, their shtick, was the sort of faceted brick towers. You know, Waterside Plaza, that was Davis Brody. Yeah.
Well, that we would have known the answer to.
All right. And they did these, and their work was, you know, people liked it because it was, you know, just a little bit more thought went into it than in your typical brown brick high rises. And as a result, their work tended to be very highly praised in the 60s and 70s. If you leaf through the AIA Guide to New York, Norval White, the co-author of that book, was something you may not know if you don't know who these guys were. He's a little lavish with praise for work by his friends, and they include Davis Brody. But you'll, from the AIA Guide, you'll come away thinking, you know, Davis Brody, they're like right up there with McKimmead and White. Okay, let's go to the corner and. What are we going to do? Let me announce now that one of our tour goers, James Rusiello, who works at the Landmarks Preservation Commission, lives here, and he just left us a little while ago because he's hosting a reception for us. Wine and cookies. So if you can just stick out this last stop, you'll be rewarded. No charge. Okay. And that's really, really nice of James, who's a good guy. Anyway, this is the complex of the Church of the Holy Trinity, an Episcopal church, and it is one of the great churches, one of the great ecclesiastical complexes of New York. One is sometimes tempted to say the greatest ecclesiastical complex in New York. It's just such a wonder to turn onto 88th Street and encounter this. It's just so fantastic. One of the reasons I'm glad I don't live up here is because I've never gotten to take this for granted. You know, in other words, over, you know, all my 30, you know, this is a number that keeps going up. I think it's now 37 years in New York, or 38, I forget. But I've never not turned on to this block of 88th and felt that sort of spark when I've seen this. And that's great. The tower is just majestic, but this is a complex that's great at the level of detail and great at the level of plan, great at the level of skyline. It gives some much needed openness to these cramped tenement blocks, as it was meant to do. That open space wasn't just aesthetic, it wasn't incidental, it was part of the reason for being of Holy Trinity Church, which was conceived as a settlement church. You've heard of settlement houses, but some churches were settlement churches. They provided settlement house facilities, everything from cooking classes to showers and athletic facilities and so forth, but all of it organized around the church. The architects were Barney and Chapman. They did another thing very much along these lines on East 14th Street, what is now called Immaculate Conception Church, but which was originally called Grace Chapel. Its facilities included an actual hospital. I mean, you know, where like heart surgery was done and so on, which was free. But anyway, this was a little bit later, and it was paid for by, okay, who was Lucretia Rhinelander? Edith Wharton's mother. It was paid for by Edith Wharton's mother's first cousin, Serena, whose brother-in-law was William Rhinelander Stewart, who was the man responsible for building the Washington Arch in Washington Square. So, I mean, this family really kind of gave back to New York, right? They lived in the houses that were known as the Rhinelander houses, not to be confused with the Hardenberg Rhinelander houses. Where were the Rhinelander houses, Simeon? Oh,
East End, they're right down there.
What?
They're right down
No. They were on Washington Square North.
those Rhinelander houses.
Yeah, where 2 Fifth Avenue now is. They were torn down for beautiful 2 Fifth Avenue.
That's the back of that row house. The back of those row houses, right? On Washington Square on the north side.
No. They fronted on it. Yeah, they fronted. And yeah, where the red brick portion of 2 Fifth Avenue is. Yeah, that's where William Rhinelander, that's where Serena Rhinelander, who built this, that's where she lived. She was very quiet, very retiring. One of her obituaries said that she appeared in public only twice in her life. I find that kind of hard to believe. But in any event, Barney and Chapman were the architects. When we go through the gate...